On the evening of July 28, 1999, in the quiet city of Pembroke Park, Florida, a mother made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. Kathleen Tate needed someone to watch her friend's 6-year-old daughter, Tiffany Eunick, for just a few hours. It seemed simple enough. Her own son, Lionel, was 12 years old, practically a teenager. Responsible enough, she thought, to keep an eye on a little girl while the adults went out. But what happened in those hours would shock a nation and raise questions we're still struggling to answer today. This is the story of Lionel Tate. A story about childhood, violence, media influence, and the moment when play becomes something far darker. A story that forces us to ask, at what age does innocence end? And when a child commits an unthinkable act, who is really responsible? The answers are more disturbing than you might imagine. To understand what happened that night, we need to understand the world Lionel Tate inhabited. Born in 1987, Lionel grew up in South Florida during the golden age of professional wrestling. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a cultural phenomenon. WWF, now WWE, was everywhere. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Triple H. These weren't just athletes. They were larger-than-life superheroes who solved their problems with body slams and finishing moves. For millions of children across America, wrestling wasn't just something you watched. It was something you imitated. In backyards, on trampolines, in living rooms when parents weren't looking. Kids everywhere were practicing their favorite moves, trying to recreate the spectacle they saw on television every week. Lionel was no different. He was obsessed with wrestling. He watched it religiously. He knew all the moves, all the storylines, all the catchphrases. His mother, Kathleen, worked as a Florida Highway Patrol trooper, a demanding job with irregular hours. Lionel spent a lot of time alone, and the television became his companion, his teacher, his window into a world of strength and power. But here's what's important to understand. Lionel wasn't a violent child. There were no warning signs, no history of aggression or cruelty. Teachers described him as quiet, somewhat withdrawn. He had friends. He went to school. By all accounts, he was just ordinary. And that's what makes what happened next so terrifying. Because if it could happen to an ordinary child, in an ordinary home, on an ordinary evening, it could happen anywhere. When Kathleen Tate's friend needed help that July evening, it seemed like a simple favor. Tiffany Eunick was a sweet 6-year-old girl, small for her age, weighing only 48 pounds. She knew Lionel. Their mothers were friends. There was no reason to worry. At approximately 6 o'clock that evening, the two mothers left for their plans. Lionel and Tiffany were left alone in the house. What happened next would take less than an hour, but the repercussions would last a lifetime. Here's where the story becomes difficult, because what actually happened between 6 and 7 o'clock that evening, we only know from one source, Lionel himself, and his account has been inconsistent. What we know for certain is this: at approximately 10:30 that night, Kathleen Tate returned home. She found Tiffany lying motionless on the downstairs floor. The little girl wasn't breathing. Kathleen immediately called 911, and paramedics rushed to the scene. But it was too late. Tiffany Eunick was pronounced dead at the hospital at 11:30 p.m. The initial assumption was tragic but simple: an accident. Perhaps the child had fallen. Perhaps she had choked on something. These things happen, as horrible as they are. But when doctors examined Tiffany's small body, they found something that couldn't be explained by a simple fall or accident. The injuries were extensive, devastating. A fractured skull, a lacerated liver, torn in 2 places, broken ribs, a hemorrhaged brain, extensive bruising across her body, 35 separate injuries in total. The medical examiner's conclusion was unequivocal: These injuries were consistent with being thrown from a third-story building, or with the damage sustained in a high-speed car accident. This was no accident. When police questioned 12-year-old Lionel Tate about what had happened, he told them a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. He said they had been playing wrestling, imitating the moves they'd seen on television. He demonstrated the moves for investigators. A body slam, a pile driver, where one wrestler lifts another and drops them headfirst into the mat, elbow drops, knee strikes, all moves he'd seen performed dozens, perhaps hundreds of times on WWF programming. But here's the crucial detail that investigators seized upon. Lionel said he'd been playing these games with Tiffany for about an hour before his mother came home. An hour of body slams, an hour of pile drivers, an hour of a 12-year-old boy who weighed approximately 170 pounds, performing wrestling moves on a 6-year-old girl who weighed 48 pounds. The mathematics alone were horrifying. But Lionel's initial statement suggested something even more disturbing. He said he hadn't noticed anything was wrong. He said Tiffany had just stopped moving and he'd gone upstairs. When his mother came home hours later and found Tiffany, Lionel claimed to be surprised that something had happened. Investigators found this implausible. The injuries Tiffany sustained would have caused immediate, obvious trauma. Screaming, crying, visible damage. How could he not have noticed? This question would become central to the case, because it spoke to intent, to awareness, to the fundamental question of what Lionel Tate understood about what he was doing. Was this really just a game that went tragically wrong? Or was there something darker at play? The autopsy report offered disturbing clues. The pattern of injuries suggested not a single incident, but sustained, repeated trauma. The lacerated liver, in particular, would have required significant force, the kind of force that, experts testified, could not have been accidental. One forensic pathologist described it this way: "These injuries were consistent with child abuse, not with children playing." But Lionel maintained his story. They were wrestling. He was imitating what he saw on TV. He didn't mean to hurt her. It was an accident. The question facing prosecutors was unprecedented. How do you charge a 12-year-old child with murder? In Florida, as in many states, the law provides mechanisms to try juvenile offenders as adults when the crimes are serious enough. But this typically applies to teenagers, 15, 16, 17 years old, not children barely out of elementary school. And yet, the severity of Tiffany's injuries and the questions surrounding Lionel's account led prosecutors to make a controversial decision. They would charge Lionel Tate as an adult with first-degree murder. If convicted, he would face a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. 12 years old, and facing the same sentence as the most hardened adult criminals. The case was about to become a national sensation. The trial of Lionel Tate began in January 2001, 18 months after Tiffany's death. By this time, Lionel was 14 years old, but under Florida law, he would be tried as an adult for a crime committed when he was 12. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. They presented the medical evidence: 35 injuries, including a fractured skull and a liver torn in 2 places. They presented expert testimony stating that these injuries required significant force and could not have been accidental. They argued that Lionel's account, that he was simply playing and didn't realize anything was wrong, was impossible to believe given the severity of the trauma. But it was the defense's strategy that captured the nation's attention and sparked a debate that continues to this day. Lionel's attorney, Jim Lewis, built his case around a simple but powerful idea. Lionel Tate was a victim too. A victim of the violent media he had been exposed to since childhood. Lewis argued that Lionel had been so saturated with images of wrestling violence that he couldn't distinguish between the staged entertainment on television and real-world consequences. He presented evidence of Lionel's extensive viewing habits, hours upon hours of WWF programming. He brought in psychologists who testified about the developing adolescent brain and its ability to understand cause and effect, fantasy versus reality. The defense painted a picture of a child who had been essentially brainwashed by media violence. A child who genuinely believed he was just playing, because that's what he'd been taught by thousands of hours of television. This was the wrestling defense, and it was controversial from the start. Critics argued it was an attempt to shift blame from Lionel to an abstract concept of media influence, avoiding personal responsibility. Supporters argued it raised legitimate questions about what we expose children to and what we can reasonably expect them to understand. But there was a problem with the defense strategy. A significant problem. The prosecution presented evidence that contradicted the narrative of an innocent child simply playing. They revealed that after the incident, Lionel had gone upstairs and watched television, leaving Tiffany's body downstairs. He hadn't called for help. He hadn't told anyone. When his mother came home hours later, he hadn't immediately explained what happened. This suggested consciousness of guilt. It suggested awareness that something wrong had occurred. Moreover, forensic experts testified that the sustained nature of the injuries, multiple blows over an extended period, indicated this wasn't a single wrestling move gone wrong, but a prolonged assault. The prosecution argued that Lionel knew exactly what he was doing, that he may have become angry with Tiffany during their time together, that this wasn't an accident at all, but murder disguised as play. And then, there was the question that haunted the courtroom. Even if Lionel didn't intend to kill Tiffany, at what point during an hour of body slams and pile drivers on a child one-third his size would a reasonable person realize they were causing harm? The defense had one more strategy. They attempted to negotiate a plea bargain. Prosecutors offered a deal. Lionel would plead guilty to second-degree murder and receive a sentence of 3 years in a juvenile facility followed by probation. 3 years versus life in prison. It seemed like an obvious choice. But Lionel's mother, Kathleen, refused to accept the deal. She maintained her son's innocence. She believed that making him plead guilty would be admitting to something he didn't do, that this was truly an accident, and he should not be held criminally responsible. It was a gamble. A terrible, high-stakes gamble. And on March 9, 2001, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. The judge had no choice. Under Florida law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence. No discretion. No exceptions. Lionel Tate, now 14 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He became the youngest person in modern American history to receive such a sentence. The courtroom erupted. Lionel's mother collapsed. Even some who believed in his guilt were shocked by the sentence. Because whatever Lionel had done, whatever the truth of that evening, he was still a child. And now that child would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. The case sparked immediate national outrage and debate. Civil rights organizations argued that trying a 12-year-old as an adult violated basic principles of justice and child development. They pointed to neuroscience research showing that the adolescent brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. By this standard, could we really hold a 12-year-old to the same level of accountability as an adult? Others argued that the severity of the crime demanded serious consequences. Tiffany Eunick was dead. A 6-year-old girl who trusted Lionel, who was placed in his care, who should have been safe. Her family's grief was profound and permanent. Didn't justice demand that Lionel be held accountable? But there was another dimension to the debate that made it even more complex. Race and socioeconomics. Lionel Tate was African American. He came from a working-class background. His mother was a single parent working long hours. Critics noted that white children from affluent families charged with similar crimes often received very different treatment: psychiatric evaluation, rehabilitation-focused sentences, second chances. Was Lionel's harsh sentence a reflection of equal justice or of systemic bias? The media influence question also dominated headlines. Wrestling organizations defended themselves, arguing that their programming included disclaimers telling children not to imitate what they saw. They pointed out that millions of children watched wrestling without committing violence. But child development experts raised troubling questions. They noted that disclaimers are ineffective for young children who lack the cognitive development to apply abstract warnings to concrete situations. They discussed the mean world syndrome, the phenomenon where heavy exposure to media violence can desensitize individuals and distort their perception of acceptable behavior. Studies had shown that children who watched extensive violent media were more likely to exhibit aggressive behavior, to view violence as an acceptable problem-solving method, and to underestimate the real-world consequences of violent acts. But correlation isn't causation. Millions of children watched the same programming Lionel did. They didn't kill anyone. So what made Lionel different? This is where the story becomes even more troubling. Because as reporters and investigators dug deeper into Lionel's background, a more complex picture emerged. While Lionel didn't have a history of violence before Tiffany's death, there were signs that perhaps had been overlooked. Difficulties in school. Social isolation. A child spending extensive time alone with television as his primary companion. A mother working demanding hours, doing her best but stretched thin by circumstance. Some experts suggested that Lionel might have had undiagnosed psychological issues that, combined with media exposure and lack of supervision, created a perfect storm of factors. But none of this could bring Tiffany back. None of it could undo that evening in July 1999. Lionel Tate's story didn't end with his sentencing. In some ways, it was just beginning. Appeals were filed immediately. Lionel's lawyers argued that his trial had been fundamentally unfair, that trying a 12-year-old as an adult violated his constitutional rights, that the mandatory life sentence for a child was cruel and unusual punishment. And in 2004, 3 years into his sentence, an appellate court agreed. The conviction was overturned. The court ruled that Lionel had not received adequate mental health evaluation before trial, and that trying him as an adult may have been inappropriate given his age at the time of the crime. Lionel was offered a new deal: plead guilty to second-degree murder and receive a sentence of time served plus probation. This time, the deal was accepted. In January 2004, Lionel Tate was released from prison. He was 17 years old. He had spent 3 years behind bars. Now, he would be on probation until he was 27, required to wear an ankle monitor, forbidden from having contact with children, required to undergo counseling. It should have been a second chance. A chance to rebuild his life, to prove that he could become a productive member of society despite the terrible tragedy of his childhood. But Lionel's story takes another dark turn. Less than a year after his release, in May 2005, Lionel violated his probation. He was found in possession of a knife and had left his home without permission. His probation was modified, but he was allowed to remain free. Then, in May 2005, everything fell apart again. Lionel Tate was arrested for armed robbery. He had been working at a pizza delivery job when he and an accomplice robbed a teenager at gunpoint, taking a cell phone and some cash. This time, there was no question of his age. Lionel was 18, legally an adult. The crime was captured on surveillance footage. The evidence was overwhelming. In 2006, Lionel Tate pleaded guilty to armed robbery and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The second chance had been squandered. When this news broke, the national conversation shifted dramatically. Those who had argued for leniency, who had seen Lionel as a child who deserved rehabilitation, felt betrayed. Those who had argued that he was dangerous, that the original life sentence was appropriate, felt vindicated. But perhaps the truth was more complicated than either narrative allowed. Child psychologists noted that Lionel's trajectory was sadly predictable. He had spent his formative adolescent years in an adult prison, arguably the worst possible environment for rehabilitation. He emerged traumatized, with limited education, few job prospects, and PTSD from his incarceration. He was placed on strict probation with an ankle monitor, marked publicly as a killer. What kind of normal life could he possibly build from that foundation? Research consistently shows that children tried as adults and incarcerated in adult facilities have significantly higher recidivism rates than those handled in the juvenile system. They receive less education, less counseling, less preparation for reentry into society. They emerge more damaged than when they entered. Lionel Tate's story became a case study in the failure of the system to genuinely rehabilitate young offenders. But others argued that this was simply who Lionel was, that the robbery proved the killing of Tiffany wasn't an accident at all, but the action of someone with criminal tendencies. The debate continued, but Tiffany Eunick remained dead, and Lionel Tate remained in prison. Today, Lionel Tate is in his late 30s, still serving his sentence in a Florida prison. If he completes his full term, he won't be released until he's in his late 40s, most of his life spent behind bars. The case of Lionel Tate and Tiffany Eunick has left a complicated legacy. It sparked important conversations about juvenile justice, media influence, child development, and the purpose of our criminal system. In the years since 1999, several important changes have occurred. The Supreme Court has ruled that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles are unconstitutional, except in cases of homicide with specific aggravating factors. Many states have reformed their laws about trying children as adults, requiring more rigorous evaluation and consideration of developmental factors. Wrestling organizations have added more prominent warnings and educational initiatives about the dangers of imitating what's seen on television. Research on media violence and child development has expanded, providing more nuanced understanding of how exposure affects different children in different circumstances. But the fundamental questions remain unresolved. When a child commits a terrible act, how much is that child responsible? At what age can we reasonably expect a person to understand the full consequences of violence? How much influence does media have on behavior? And at what point does individual responsibility override that influence? Perhaps most troubling, what should our justice system do with child offenders? Is punishment the goal, or rehabilitation? Can someone who commits violence at age 12 be transformed into a productive adult? Or are certain lines, once crossed, impossible to uncross? There are no easy answers. Tiffany Eunick's family deserves justice, deserves acknowledgement of their devastating loss. But what form should that justice take when the perpetrator is himself a child? Lionel Tate's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our society, about how we supervise children, about what we allow them to watch, about how we handle young people who commit serious crimes, about whether our justice system is truly designed to protect and rehabilitate, or simply to punish and warehouse. The evening of July 28, 1999, lasted only a few hours, but its implications will continue for lifetimes. 2 children entered that house. Only one came out alive. And in a very real sense, both lives ended that night. What happened in those hours we'll never fully know. The only 2 people who could tell us were a 12-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. One is dead. The other's testimony has been inconsistent, possibly traumatized by what occurred, possibly concealing the full truth. Was it truly an innocent game gone horribly wrong? Or was there anger, frustration, something darker that we're uncomfortable acknowledging in a child? The answer matters, because it determines whether Lionel Tate is a victim of circumstance who deserves compassion, or a perpetrator who deserves punishment. Whether the media bears responsibility for saturating children with violent images, or whether personal accountability must remain paramount regardless of age. Perhaps the most honest answer is that it's both, and neither. That reality is more complex than our legal system's binary of guilty or innocent, victim or perpetrator. What we can say with certainty is this: a little girl named Tiffany Eunick died violently and tragically. Her family's grief is real and enduring. And a boy named Lionel Tate, whether through malice or tragic miscalculation, took her life and destroyed his own in the process. Two families were shattered. Two lives were lost in different ways. And we're left with questions we still don't know how to answer. This is the story of Lionel Tate. A story without heroes, without easy villains, without simple lessons. A story that asks us to look honestly at who we are, what we believe about children and justice and responsibility and redemption. A story that has no ending, because the questions it raises will continue as long as children have access to violence and our justice system struggles to know what to do when childhood innocence collides with terrible acts. The only certainty is what we started with. On July 28, 1999, in a house in Pembroke Park, Florida, something happened that changed everything. The details may remain debated. The responsibility may remain contested. The appropriate response may remain uncertain. But the consequences are eternal.